Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. It's that time of year again. The Oscars are here. It's genuinely one of my favorite weekends of the year. There was a time when I would try to see as many of the nominated films as possible. From the Best Picture nominees, to the foreign language films, to the animated shorts. There was one year in particular, 2011, when I holed up at a movie theater in Times Square, just around the corner from where I'm speaking these words. I holed up there for 24 straight hours to watch all 10 Best Picture nominees. This was a movie marathon that was organized by the movie chain. This wasn't just me, planning out my own schedule. It was great. It was exhausting. It started at 10 a.m., and this was the order of films. Toy Story 3, followed by 127 Hours. The Kids Are All Right, True Grit, The Fighter, Winter's Bone, Black Swan at about midnight, which is appropriate given that movie. Inception at 2 a.m., which is even more appropriate given it's a movie about dreams. The Social Network at 4:30 in the morning, and then The King's Speech to round it all out. I remember stretching myself across the front row at this movie theater and really trying to stay awake while watching Colin Firth and Jeffrey Rush sort of hash it out. So, side note, should you ever find yourself in a 24-hour movie marathon at a movie theater, a pro tip is don't go hard on the popcorn or the soda too fast, too soon. You will regret it. You have to parcel it out a little bit at a time. Sunday, March 12th marks the 95th Academy Awards ceremony, and just in time, our staff critic, Alexandra Jacobs, has reviewed two big books about the Oscars. The first, Oscar Wars, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears, is by the New Yorker writer Michael Schulman. The second, The Academy and the Award, is by Bruce Davis, a former president of the Academy. Alexandra, hello.
Hi, Gilbert. I have a question, which is when you went on this movie marathon, did you pay for each one, or were you doing that thing you used to be able to do where you could just see a movie and then sneak into the theater?
I've never sneaked into a movie. I'm too much of a goody two-shoes to do so. So this was a thing that no free ads here, so I'm not going to name the movie theater chain, but the movie theater chain put this thing together. The theater was full of people who went there specifically for this 24-hour movie marathon. This was when Snuggies were big, so there were a lot of people wearing Snuggies because they knew they might fall asleep there. Other people had giant blankets. I think it was the third year in a row they did it, and there were some guys who had made T-shirts because they had done it in previous years.
Is anyone doing that now?
No, I think they maybe stopped doing it after that year.
Maybe I rest my case then.
But what they do now is Marvel movie marathons. So up to years ago, up to the release of the Avengers movies, I think you could watch 15 Marvel movies in a row over the course of however many hours. Anyway, hello.
Hi.
Yes, we're here to talk about the Oscars.
Yes, we are. I never did that, by the way. I never did a Snuggie movie marathon.
I have a feeling it would not appeal to you. No, it was pretty grimy.
But I did used to report on red carpet fashion. For a time I did.
I think red carpet might come up a little later, specifically when we talk about Michael Schulman's book. Tell me a little bit about writing about these two books together. They're both pretty big.
They're pretty big. As I noted in the piece that I wrote about them, there was also another big book that I wanted to review this year, but someone took it away from me. Hollywood, The Oral History by Janine Bassinger and Sam Wasson. And I just thought it was interesting. I mean, there are always books about the Academy Awards. There are official books. There are, beautiful coffee table books full of pictures. And there are many, many histories of various kinds. But I thought, given where we are in the history of moviedom and post-pandemic, and I just thought it was interesting that there are these three heavy books that are sort of treating the Oscars almost like they're not over, but definitely, as I say in the piece, are they history? They're history. Hollywood, the oral history. What is it? When you call something history, it means it's past, or at least, it's being assessed, and we're not in it. We're looking back at it. Now, we are in it, but I thought it was an interesting moment to mark.
So where are we?
Well, it's Oscars turning 95, right? So where are we? I mean, we're at a moment where going to see a movie is just not what it was. I mean, you and I both remember a time, as you've just noted, when you would go to a theater with great excitement and I think now the boundary between what's a movie and what is something streaming into your living room that you can pause at will and fall asleep during and just sort of see whenever is increasingly porous. So I just think the kind of sense of pomp and importance around the Academy Awards has softened a little bit, because I think younger viewers coming up don't really understand, unless they're sort of specialists, or they don't really understand what's special about a feature film as opposed to a series that they stream or any other streaming content, as they call it, content. So as I say in the piece, when I say to my teenagers, hey, why don't you go to a movie? To me, when I was growing up, going to a movie was the most exciting thing you could do. It was definitely above watching a TV show in terms of class of activity. It was a date. It was fun. It was exciting. It was very special. And the excitement around the Oscars that I felt every year paralleled that. And now my kids are like, well, they don't care. They don't need to see it in the theater. It's going to come to our living room eventually. It's just not the same thing for them. And that's interesting.
Oscar Wars, in particular, the Michael Schulman book, it feels like if you care about Oscar history, which, again, I don't know how large that market is anymore, there's sort of something for everyone in that it goes through a bunch of different eras in Oscar history and presents really well-researched stories about the founding of the Oscar, about Bette Davis versus Gloria Swanson versus Judy Holliday, goes into the blacklist and Dalton Trumbo. It goes into the year when Jaws and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and a bunch of other sort of amazing new Hollywood movies were nominated. Talk to me about a couple of your favorite segments in the book, your favorite chapters.
It's funny, I was going to mention another book about the movies that I really like, which is a book by a guy named Sam Staggs called All About Eve, which to me, All About Eve is sort of the quintessential Oscar piece. You know, it's an older actress who's jealous of a younger actress, and in the movie they're competing for the Sarah Siddons Award. That I didn't realize that Bette Davis actually didn't win the Oscar for that role, which tells you something, I think. But I love the chapter where Schulman goes into the contest between Bette Davis and Gloria Swanson, who was in Sunset Boulevard, and then, of course, spoiler alert, Judy Holliday won for Born Yesterday, which I think people don't remember as much as those other two movies, which are the epitome of Hollywood classics. Not that Born Yesterday isn't very good. But, you know, there's been so much ink spilled on Harvey Weinstein, obviously, including a biography by Ken Oletta, Schulman's colleague, that I reviewed this year. And I thought Schulman did a really good job reminding us how kind of revolutionary in their way, but brutal, Weinstein's tactics for getting his movies Oscars were. And, you know, at the time it was seen as something sort of heroic outside the industry. Like, oh, Harvey's the champion of movies, and Gwyneth Paltrow is the first lady of Miramax, or the princess of Miramax, or whatever. And then just looking back with all that we know now that's been reported both in our own paper and in the New Yorker, Schulman did a really good job of sort of reporting out how the industry regarded it at the time. We on the outside were seeing Harvey the hero championing high art, whatever, and to look and see that he was actually undermining Steven Spielberg or bad-mouthing, just using tactics that were really kind of underhand. I mean, it's not surprising to look back on that, but his lobbying was just nonstop.
It's interesting to reflect on that this year when there was all the hubbub about the Andrea Riseborough nomination. It was a surprise Best Actress nomination in which, sort of in the last week or so of campaigning, a bunch of her friends and fellow actors and the like had a social media campaign essentially to get her nominated. It is a campaign. Campaign means what it means, and we like to think that this is a ceremony, a process about merit, but I think that has been proven wrong time and time again.
It's like a political election or a sports contest that turns on a single play or call. So these books really reveal that. It's just interesting to how many times Oscar, as one of these authors put it, got it wrong. Like the movie that won isn't the one that you remember, or isn't the one that Time judges as the best one. That's fascinating to see.
I would ask what your favorite example of that is, but I feel like there's a prime example in the book, which of course is the famous year when Citizen Kane lost out on a Best Picture win to a movie that is not a bad movie at all.
Yeah.
How Green Was My Valley is a very good movie, but as Schulman puts, a large part of the reason that Citizen Kane sort of floundered is because William Randolph Hearst and his empire tried to suppress the movie as much as possible.
Isn't that amazing?
Because it was essentially a movie about him.
That's right. It's amazing. You might ask, what does this ceremony matter if it's not even adjudicating properly? But
why does it matter?
I think it matters because, I mean, look, it's the electronic hearth that around which we gather less and less. So I think it matters because people crave communal entertainment experiences, and it's a contest. Why do we watch the Super Bowl? Even if it's not your team or you hate football, maybe you don't.
One of the other books you write about is more of an insider view. It's by a former bigwig at the Academy.
Well, it's an insider view, but interestingly, Bruce Davis, I thought he did an amazing job. He really stepped outside. The book is about he calls it a Bildungsroman about the Oscars, and he's really focusing on the early period and how the Academy Awards got started. He wasn't around when that happened. So he had incredible access to the archives, the Academy Award archives, and really goes down a lot of different, as they say, rabbit holes. You know, he's debunking a lot of myths about a lot of received wisdom about why this is named that or why things are done this way or that way. And it's a very beautifully written book. I highly recommend it.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm joined by Alexandra Jacobs, a staff critic at The Times who has written about 2 new books that look at the history of the Oscars. Alexandra, one of the things I really want to talk about is great movie books. Books about the movies, books about the Oscars. I have ones that I love. I'd love to hear a couple from you.
Well, I have a whole shelf at home devoted to these sorts of books.
I knew it.
Yes, I do. It's not that far from my John Updike shelf. And I enjoyed the books I wrote about this week, but focus on one picture to sort of show the kind of... One of my editors once said it's always easier to write about a person than an idea, and I think the same thing applies to moviedom. It's just sort of easier to write about one movie, I think, than it is to show the tableau of Hollywood than it is to taking on Hollywood as a subject is just as this 700-page oral history show. I mean, that's a big beast. So I think I mentioned before I love the All About Eve book by Sam Staggs. It just is a look at everything that went into what I consider definitely in the top 5 best movies of all time. Another great book is Devil's Candy, The Bonfire of the Vanities Goes to Hollywood by Julie Solomon, who I think recently did a podcast on it.
I think so, yeah.
And it might be of particular interest to listeners to this podcast because it's about the translation of The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe from book to screen. And of course, the book was much more successful than the movie was. I love Pictures Out of Revolution by Mark Harris, who's a wonderful writer that you may know.
Let's just put it on the table.
Okay. Our former colleague, Mark Harris, is a wonderful, who contributes to The Times sometimes. He is one of the greatest writers on show business. He did a Mike Nichols biography not that long ago. And this book is sort of about that moment in movie history when Hollywood's turning away from the studio system. I think, as I recall, he focuses on 1967. And it's beautifully written. It's beautifully reported. Highly recommend. Thumbs up.
Great book.
Great book. Yeah. And then there's one I want to read but haven't yet, which I think came out last year, and I don't think the Times reviewed it, which was a mistake. It's called Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli by Mark Seal, which is about the making of The Godfather. I mean, who cannot want to read that? And by Mark Seal, Vanity Fair journalist, great guy.
I would 100% have mentioned any of Mark Harris's books. Pictures of a Revolution, the Mike Nichols book. He also wrote a book called Five Came Back, which is about a bunch of famous Hollywood directors who went essentially to film World War II.
Deep cut on Mark Harris. I like it.
That's quite good. Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, of course, by Peter Biskin, which documents with a lot of gossip, sort of the period between the late 60s and early 80s when New Hollywood, the movie brats sort of took over.
Also by an insider turned observer, which is interesting.
A lot of great stories in there. Are they all 100% true? A lot of great stories. William Goldman, who is a novelist, or who was a novelist, he was a screenwriter. He wrote the books The Princess Bride and Marathon Man. He also wrote the screenplay for those movies, but he wrote the screenplays for All the President's Men, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He wrote a book called Adventures in the Screen Trade, which is, I think, probably one of the best books about screenwriting ever. It's wonderful. He's wonderful. You might also know Alexandra because you care about the theater. He wrote a book called The Season.
Oh, I read The Season. Yeah, that was a tough read.
You're sort of constitutionally, I feel like, obligated to read The Season if you cover theater or Broadway in any way.
I found that a very, very difficult to read.
Just a couple more. I love conversation books. These are sort of like two directors or two famous people talking about movies. The most famous one, of course, is Hitchcock Truffaut, which is a conversation between the French New Wave upstart and the master of suspense. But then there is one called Conversations with Wilder. And this is Cameron Crowe.
Wow.
Full book-length conversation with Billy Wilder, who he sort of sees himself taking after. So Cameron Crowe, writer-director Jerry Maguire, and Almost Famous, talking to the guy behind Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, Sunset Boulevard, just
big shoes.
Some of the greats.
Yeah.
And then finally one more obscure one, which is called The Conversations. So this is the author Michael Ondaatje interviewing Walter Murch. Walter Murch is the film and sound editor who worked on The Conversation. He worked on all of the Godfather movies. He worked on Apocalypse Now. And he worked on The English Patient, which is where the two met. Michael Ondaatje wrote The English Patient.
Right.
Walter Murch was working on the sound and editing for the film adaptation of The English Patient.
Bringing us back full circle to Harvey Weinstein.
This is 1,000% not where I want to end this conversation. So I'd love to hear just one final thought on ratings aside. You're never going to be able to guess or predict or what have you. Where do you hope the Oscars continues to go?
Well, interestingly, Bruce Davis, the author of the Academy and the award, predicts or envisions, says he could see them becoming something like the National Book Awards, which I thought was an amazing observation because you've attended the National Book Awards.
Yeah, the Oscars for books.
Exactly. Well, maybe now the Oscars will be the National Book Awards for movies. But I like that. I mean, I thought it was interesting. He's indicating that people still care enough to delineate the profession of movie making, the work that goes into it, the artistry, all of that. I mean, it's funny what a mess the Oscars have been. The commercial and the commerce and the art mingling and clashing is amazing to think about. And maybe the Oscars will become less about commerce and more about art. I don't know. Because the National Book Awards aren't about what sells the most. It's not about the bestseller list, increasingly.
I'm actually not going to be watching the Oscars this year for the first time
because it's not your job anymore, too.
No, well, it's not my job anymore. That is true. But even if it was not, I would still watch it because the Oscars has meant so much to me for most of my life. I'm going to be on vacation many hours ahead, and I'm not watching this at 2 a.m.
Well, I'll tell you one reason why. When you asked before, why do we watch it or whatever, I think one reason I'll tune in is it's the possibility of live television. I mean, Schulman wrote about the moment in 2017 when they named La La Land Best Picture, and then they realized it was Moonlight, and then last year the slap, the infamous slap heard around the world. I mean, I think people want to see these sort of high-stakes dramatic moments. So that's one reason to watch. It's entertaining.
Well,
spontaneous television.
Sunday, March 12th marks the 95th Academy Awards ceremony. And just in time, our staff critic, Alexandra Jacobs, has reviewed 2 big books about the Oscars. The first, Oscar Wars, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears, is by the New Yorker writer Michael Schulman. The second, The Academy and the Award, is by Bruce Davis, a former bigwig at the Academy.
I love the word bigwig. I'm so happy we got bigwig.
A former poobah.
Yeah, exactly. Not as bad as La Honcho's. Not good. Bigwig's good.
If we're ranking, is it Bigwig, Poobah, Hodcho?
Yeah, Bigwig is number one.
Well, Alexandra, I feel like the orchestra is about to play us off. So let's call it here. Thank you so much for being on this week.
Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with New York Times staff critic Alexandra Jacobs. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.